Hi, friends. Father Kerry Walters here, pastor of Holy Spirit American National Catholic Church, and this is another Holy Spirit moment. This one on Sir Thomas More and conscience. We recently saw the 541st anniversary of the birth of Sir and Saint Thomas More, the Lord Chancellor of England who famously defied Henry VIII and lost his head for his pains. And so it seems to me that it's a good opportunity for us to reflect upon a concept that has become almost irretrievably associated with Thomas More, and I'm talking about conscience. He seems to have been for years and years a paragon of conscience, although we'll see in just a moment that that reputation has slipped to a certain extent recently. And so it's good to ask ourselves, what is conscience that he supposedly exemplifies? Before we talk about that, however, I really do need to try and sweep away two fictional caricatures of Thomas More that have become so popular within the last few years that they have usurped our accurate understanding of who he actually was and what he actually stood for. Both of these caricatures are very entertaining, and I recommend the works in which they appear to you without any reservation whatsoever. But I also would want to emphasize that they are fiction. The first caricature that I'm talking about is probably the more famous of the two. It is the Thomas More that appears in the play and subsequent movie A Man for All Seasons, written by the playwright Robert Bolt. The play was published in 1960, and the film came out 6 years later in 1966. Now, in that particular film, Robert Bolt portrays Thomas More as a man of conscience and as a man whose conscience leads him to run counter to Henry VIII's desire. But Robert Bolt defines conscience in a way that would never have occurred to Thomas More or any of his contemporaries for that matter. For Robert Bolt, conscience seems to be showing fidelity to a personal or private set of moral principles that one has either chosen or has actually invented for oneself. That's what conscience is, to remain true to oneself, as it were, with oneself being the ultimate foundation or source of value. That comes across quite clearly in A Man for All Seasons. And it seems to me that it reflects more the character of Robert Bolt than of Thomas More. Bolt was a left-leaning individual who was active in certain left-wing oppositions to what he considered to be overweening state authority. And his Thomas More becomes a similar kind of figure. The other caricature that leans to the opposite extreme is one that has been recently given us by the British novelist Hilary Mantel. And I'm talking about her portrayal of Thomas More in her wonderful novel, Wolf Hall. The novel was published in 2009 and subsequently a very popular television miniseries that came out in 2015. Once again, offered this caricature of Thomas More. Thomas More, in her novel and in the miniseries, comes across not as a man of conscience, but a man really of no conscience whatsoever. He is an ambitious ladder climber. He's a sycophantic to one extent or another until he's finally pushed into a corner. He is extremely intolerant. Mantel depicts him as a religious fanatic, a religious zealot who relentlessly tortures and persecutes and executes people whom he considers to be heretics. Once again, however, it seems to me that this portrait of Thomas More is more reflective of author Mantel than of Thomas More himself. Mantel freely confesses in interviews that she despises the Roman Catholic Church in which she was brought up. She says that she was a born Protestant and that only disreputable people would find Catholicism attractive. And it seems to me that her peak at Catholicism, whether it's justified or not, has unjustifiably influenced her portrait of Thomas More. So, who is he, and what sense can we make of him as an exemplar of conscience? Well, he is a human being like the rest of us. He has his faults, he has his weaknesses. It is true that as Lord Chancellor, he persecuted heretics, primarily Lutherans and evangelicals, and actually seems to have been involved in the execution of 6 of them, directly involved in the execution of 3 of them. And that's a horrible blot upon his reputation. No one will deny that, and it seems to go against conscience, doesn't it? Everything that you and I probably would consider to be conscience. But on the other hand, he was a remarkably talented and, in his own way, good man as well. He was extremely religious and defended his religion with his pen throughout his entire adult life. He was a leading figure in what's come to be known as the Northern Renaissance. He was a great friend of Erasmus, who probably is the most famous figure in the Northern Erasmus. He was a reformer of the very church that he loved. Like Erasmus, he saw the need for certain liturgical and moral reforms if the church was to make itself credible to the faithful. He was an author, writing perhaps most famously the utopian novel Utopia. He actually coins that particular word. He also wrote 2 books, one of them left unfinished during the 14 months he spent in the Tower of London, awaiting execution, after he had refused to do what Henry wanted him to. More of that in just a moment. He was an enlightened parent who saw to it that his daughters were educated and not simply his sons. But it is the case, and it cannot be denied, that alongside all of these wonderful accomplishments and alongside his absolutely undoubtable religious fervor, he was an individual who persecuted and did horrible things to heretics in his lifetime. He was Lord Chancellor as well under Henry VIII, and he eventually clashed with Henry VIII when Henry, as we all know, wanted to divorce his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, because she was unable to provide him with a male heir, and asked the Pope for a dispensation, which the Pope refused. Henry then, miffed at the refusal, proclaimed himself the spiritual head of English Christianity. And Thomas More resisted both of those proclamations on Henry's part and lost his head as a consequence. Thomas More resisted Henry, as he tells us in his own letters, out of conscience. So what does he mean by conscience, and why do we so admire his stand? Well, for More, conscience wasn't at all what Bolt sees it as being, as a kind of loyalty to private sets of values. No, for More, and indeed for all of his contemporaries, and indeed for the entire Western tradition, up to and beyond More, conscience is a knowledge or an awareness of objective, independently existing moral principles that ought to be followed, that demand our fidelity, our loyalty as we go through life. Conscience is a knowledge of those principles. It's an awareness of the distance between our behavior and those principles. And it's also a call to clean up our act, as it were. This is what Thomas More insisted he was relying upon when he defied Henry VIII. His conscience told him that Henry VIII, a political leader, did not have the authority, did not have the prerogative to claim for himself spiritual leadership and thereby create, as it were, his own kind of religion and certainly his own private moral code. And that's all to the good. Bravo for Sir Thomas More at that point. However, the difficulty is that More's conscience seems to have failed him when it came to people who he considered to be heretical, who had broken with the Roman Catholic tradition. It seems to be the case that at that point, More's fidelity to Rome and his fear that Christendom was breaking up with the advent of the Reformation outweighed the moral principles that a person of conscience would fall back on and show fidelity to. The virtues, for example, are the moral principles that a person of conscience will heed. Virtues such as courage and temperance, prudence, justice, any and all of these virtues surely would have inhibited Thomas More from persecuting and actually executing heretics had he heeded his conscience at that time. But again, his loyalty to Rome and his fear of the dissolution of Christendom, I think, outshouted the call of his conscience in that regard. And it's especially an egregious failing, it must be admitted, in a Christian who has not only the standard Aristotelian virtues as independent moral principles that ought to be heeded, but also has the teachings of Christ, which ought to be heeded. And it's difficult, if not impossible, to imagine that there are any circumstances whatsoever in which Christ would say that it is not only okay, but is morally obligatory to execute people because you disagree with their religious perspective. So, my friends, I think that Thomas More is a man to be admired. I think he is a man to be emulated insofar as he understood what conscience is, and he was courageous enough to take a conscience driven stand against what he saw to be the evil usurpation of religious authority on the part of the state. But we ought also to keep in mind that Thomas More did not always live up to the dictates of conscience, and his persecution of heretics is perhaps the most glaring example of that. We can admire him without whitewashing his faults, and we can spot his faults and point them out as salutary reminders to us without demonizing him in the way that Mantel does in her novel Wolf Hall. I'm Father Kerry Walters, and this has been another Holy Spirit moment. Thank you, and I will see you next time.